You are listening to SRM Insider. This is the Cyber Intelligence Briefing, your weekly roundup of the latest cybersecurity news and insights, straight from SRM's leading global incident response team. This is episode 3 of SRM's Cyber Intelligence Briefing. I'm k.schwaeble, and I'm joined by my colleagues Miles Arkwright and j.tytler.
Thanks, Carl. Excited to be here. Hi, both.
We're covering 7 stories this week. We'll spend a bit of time discussing a recent business email compromise campaign that's been targeting law firms. We'll touch on cyber activity relating to the ongoing conflict in Israel and Gaza. Equifax has been fined over £11 million for its infamous data breach in 2017. 2 airlines and the US genomics company 23andMe have suffered data breaches. NASDAQ-listed CDW have reportedly received an $80 million ransom demand, and Windows Server 2012 has reached end of support. Over the last month or so, SRM has observed a pretty dramatic increase in business email compromise incidents. Interestingly, the overwhelming majority of victims have been law firms. James, I know we've both responded to a couple of these ourselves. Why do you think law firms have been targeted so much in this campaign?
Well, I think one of the reasons law firms make such attractive targets is because they often have very large client bases with many different active accounts. So that means there are many potential victims for payment redirection fraud or invoice fraud.
We've seen quite a few interesting tactics and techniques used in these attacks. There seems to be a particular focus on bypassing multi-factor authentication. We touched on this last week when we discussed the phishing campaign that was abusing the Indeed recruitment site brand, and how threat actors were stealing session cookies to bypass MFA. We're definitely seeing that happen in this campaign as well. Miles, maybe you can describe some of the other techniques that we've seen.
Yeah, sure. So we are seeing a few interesting novel techniques at the moment. One being after a threat actor has compromised the victim's account, they are adding their own MFA method to the account to maintain persistence. And then the other one is that we're seeing some phishing emails that are now encouraging victims to scan a QR code with their phone. Once scanned, victims are then led to a malicious website where they are prompted to provide their own account credentials. Worryingly, this method is also bypassing traditional anti-phishing tools.
I'd add as well that in our response team, we're also seeing more and more instances where the initial phishing message is actually being distributed via Microsoft Teams, coming from an external tenant.
Thanks, guys. We've published a detailed briefing on this campaign on our website, so if you'd like to read more about it, go check it out. Now, before we move on to the next story, we've obviously all seen the terrible conflict in Israel and Gaza, and our thoughts are with all the innocent victims. The physical war seems to have prompted an increase in cyber activity from supporters on both sides of this conflict.
Yes, that's right. So there's been a dramatic uptick in cyber attacks in the region, which was already a major hotspot for malicious cyber activity. So just in the last few days, we've seen hackers defacing websites and even public billboards in Tel Aviv. We've seen a fake version of the Rocket Alert app, Red Alert, which warns users about incoming missiles being pushed out on app stores. Hackers also claim to have hit the Israeli electric grid and the Iron Dome missile defense system, but we haven't seen any evidence of major disruption to critical infrastructure due to these cyber attacks to date. The websites of aid agencies offering support in both Israel and the Gaza Strip have also been hit with DDoS attacks aimed at taking them offline.
It also reminds me a bit of last week's podcast when we discussed the 8 rules published by the Red Cross for civilian hackers to follow during conflict. I think those included banning attacks on medical and humanitarian facilities.
Yeah, I suppose one can only hope that hackers follow these rules. But to move on, Kyle, I see that Equifax are now back in the news with an £11 million fine in relation to its data breach in 2017.
Yeah, that's right, Miles. The UK's Financial Conduct Authority fined Equifax, I think, just over £11 million. The FCA highlighted 2 failures in particular. Firstly, the FCA called out Equifax UK's failure to adequately monitor and manage how its parent company in the US was securing the data it was processing. Equifax was sending data for UK data subjects to the US entity, and that's where the breach actually occurred. And the second thing was that the FCA said that Equifax didn't actually handle the breach very well. Specifically, Equifax was not prepared to handle complaints from customers and actually even provided false or inaccurate information in some of its public statements.
Yeah, it does highlight how important it is for companies to understand their responsibilities as a data controller. If you're sending data onto another entity, even a parent company, you as the data controller still have to ensure that the data is protected.
Absolutely. Now, guys, there have been a few major data breaches recently as well. I know that Air Europa, the Spanish airline, they suffered a data breach and they even had to urge their customers to cancel their credit cards as a result. Unfortunately, the extent and cause of the breach has not been disclosed yet. Air Canada, obviously another airline, they've suffered a data breach as well, although this one was the result of a ransomware attack by the group BEC. They claim to have stolen 210 gigabytes of data.
Yeah, and 23andMe, the genomics company that provides a breakdown of an individual's ancestry based on their genetics, has also suffered a data breach. The genetic data of 7 million people is currently for sale on the dark web. The attackers reportedly compromised the database using valid credentials that were exposed in a breach of another online platform.
Yeah, I think this incident really shows why it's essential to have unique passwords for each and every online service you subscribe to, because we've seen hackers time and time again reusing valid credentials from other data breaches wherever they can.
Agreed. Not sure if you heard recently that CDW, the NASDAQ-listed IT company, was hit by a ransomware attack. LockBit, the group behind that attack, they reportedly demanded an $80 million ransom.
Yeah, I also heard that. In negotiations with LockBit, CDW reportedly offered $1 million, well below that ransom demand of 80 million, which has ultimately led to the breakdown in negotiations.
Yeah, it doesn't happen often, but there is always a risk that negotiations with a ransomware group can become public, particularly if the negotiations break down. So organizations engaging with threat actors should be aware of that risk when considering what their strategy will be.
Yeah. Before we go, Microsoft has announced that Windows Server 2012 has finally reached end of support and will no longer receive any security updates. Organizations should urgently upgrade their systems to a supported version of Windows Server. Microsoft also patched 104 vulnerabilities on Patch Tuesday last week, including 12 critical remote code execution vulnerabilities and 3 0-days that were being actively exploited in the wild by threat actors. So please do make sure you update your systems as soon as possible. Anyway, that brings us to an end of this week's episode. Please join us again next week. As always, you can access a written version of this briefing on our website.
Thanks, guys. Goodbye.
Until next week, goodbye.